is the Begumpur Masjid, and this is where we'll end our walk, but not before a lot of climbing to be done. Yeah. I'll talk a little bit about why they think this mosque was built, who built it, and I've been saying that there's a bit of a debate here. Now, one version is that this is the main congregation mosque for the city of Jahanpana, the one we've just been to. So like we have the Jama Masjid today for the Shah Jahanabad city, similar, and that's the principal congregation mosque there. Similarly, this would have been the principal congregation mosque in the city of Jahanpana way back when Tughlaq II was in power. So that's why when I mentioned the architect, the poet Chach mentions Al-Jayush as the fellow who is the chief architect and a fairly big important guy, and important enough to be mentioned in the poetry for the king himself. So if this was built during Muhammad Tughlaq's time, then it's a good guess that Al-Jayush is the fellow responsible as the architect for this edifice. The second version for this mosque is that this is built by during Firoz Shah's time. Firoz Shah is Tughlaq III, the successor of Tughlaq II. And Firoz Shah's capital city is at Kotla, where we have the cricket stadium. So right next to it, there's a small citadel left. That was where his city was. Now, during Firoz Shah's time, he himself was a prolific builder. And his nobility also has built a lot, not only in Delhi, but in area around Delhi as well. So in Delhi, people have identified 7 mosques, 7 large mosques, almost as big as this, which are said to have been built by the prime ministers of Firoz Shah. Now there are 2 fellows of importance here. It's a father and son duo. The first guy, his name is Khane-Jahan Telangani. Telangani from the word Telangana. Telangana, you'll know is the region way south. So he was from that region.
Deccan more than south.
Yeah. And he's from that region. He's a convert from Hinduism. He's a convert into Islam, and he still has relatives who are Hindu. So this fellow is the prime minister of Tughlaq III, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, and he's a very, very powerful chap. His tomb is now in Nizamuddin. It's mostly inaccessible, but it is there. And this fellow is so powerful as the prime minister that Firoz Shah himself calls him the king of Delhi. So he's obviously a very, very big name. He is the prime minister for a very, very long time and is succeeded by his son, Khaja Junan Shah. And he too is a very, very powerful guy. So this father and son duo are the prime ministers for a very long time under Tughlaq III, and the son actually is credited with patronizing a series of mosques in Delhi, one of which is this. The others are believed to be the masjid in Nizamuddin, the Kali Masjid in Old Delhi near Turkman Gate area, the Khidki Mosque in Saket, Malviya Nagar area. So these large mosques, so there are about 7 which he is said to have built, and Begumpuri Masjid is considered one of them. That's why I said there is a debate on whether this is Muhammad Tughlaq II's time and contemporary to Jahanpana, or built during his successor's time. So it could have been either. If it was during Muhammad II's time, the Tughlaq II's time, they say that there might have been a connection between this mosque and the palace area we have seen. Now it's all full of settlements around, like most of South Delhi, there's not an inch of space really. And in fact the village which stands outside was once upon a time inside the mosque.
Oh really?
Yes, so all this settlement, Begumpur village, which is today an urban village, it comes in the category of urban village, but way back where this area, this courtyard and the cloisters here was full of people. In fact, if you look at some older photographs, there are trees in the courtyard as well. So it was a settled area, and in the 1920s, sometime in the 1920s, this was vacated by the Archaeological Survey of India. So that's when the village went outside and this area was emptied.
So is this functional mosque today?
No. people like us who come, and of course the locals for kite flying and generally chilling out. Yeah.
Kanika, were these like areas where they would set up market stalls under the cloisters, like back then?
Typically, such things are around a mosque rather than inside.
Okay.
But this is more like an architectural style. But market could be immediately outside, like very much in the Jama Masjid area.
Right.
So these are more like verandas, right? Yeah. There need not be any rooms. Oh, they would have made partitions within these areas. The covered areas, they would have used wood, maybe even cement and bricks to create partitions and their own living space.
So it must have been a massive hotel.
Yes, yes.
Only prayer ground.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is actually, there's much more to this mosque than you see here. We're going through a very, very narrow passage into another room-like area, which was believed to be the separate prayer hall for women. And through it, we'll climb up and go up there. Beyond you, you can see that it's a separate portion which has been carved out within the larger area of the mosque. This is believed to be a separate prayer hall for women.
They had to come to this narrow place?
Probably.
They were so thin and small, all the ladies.
Yes. Come, so some more climbing through narrow staircases and then we'll be up on the terrace.
Yeah?
Hi.
It's cement mortar.
But I think that should be the fundamental one. It seems to be the nature of architecture here.
But it wasn't without plaster ever.
But maybe between stones, not all over it.
That's there, you know.
Speculation, right?
No, the thing is, whenever you build, this is of course your basic masonry for a wall or anything. But your walls are never bare. Very much like our homes now, except that we use bricks. So your walls are always plastered over. We now don't see them plastered, and we like our ruins like this. You know? Yeah, so it's also a way we've always been seeing our ruins. So, in fact, if you see a newly restored building, they often have this pink plaster, pink and orangish kind of a surface, which doesn't look nice. I never liked it, but apparently that's the done thing, because when these buildings were in use, they were active places where people lived and not monuments. That's how they might have looked like.
Okay.
Oh.
So that's what the conservators say, that when we conserve, we try and come back to the way these were. And then over a very short period, that plaster will again go black. So you have to regularly maintain it. Very much like you whitewash your own homes every Diwali, yeah? Same logic.
But Kanika, I agree with you. They should be not be restored with the plaster and all that. But I don't know if you saw the dome. They had the things hanging. The stone bricks were hanging. That could be very dangerous.
It is.
At any given time.
Absolutely, that's absolutely, yeah.
Those are the things you need to strike to them.
Absolutely. I don't like bricks
I'm
hanging
gonna
over my
assign
head.
you the job.
Okay, so the idea here is to climb up further, and there are various ways of going it. So, and so you are free to explore on your own as well. So there are a couple of entrances over here, around the dome as well.
दूसरी तरफ भी है इधर.
So feel free, and because if everybody is at one entrance only, it's going to be a traffic jam there.
Are you going to keep a head count?
No, nobody's getting. Yeah. Conclude what we've been talking about all this while. Let me get somewhere in the middle so that everybody can hear me. So just to wrap up what we've been talking about, our sources and lack of information and the kind of people who have commented on Jahanpana and the city around. I've been constantly talking about Ibn Battuta and his travelogues. And I mentioned earlier that it's not really an official document as such. Yeah, it's peppered with lots of his personal insights and what he felt about people, what he sees, and what he is fascinated by. So he mentions all kinds of things like seeing a rhino in the Punjab area. He mentions the samosa. Yeah, samosa finds mention in his travels. It's called the samosak. And it's a non-veg samosa actually. It's
like sambusak.
Samosak, yeah.
Is that what you're going to feed us today?
No.
Is it?
What, the non-veg samosas?
Rhinos.
There are no rhinos, so no
Or rhino
samosas to match. So this samosa is all, full of minced meat, almonds and raisins and dry fruits and fried in ghee. He mentions pan. He mentions pan, betel leaf, after a meal. He also witnesses a sati. The burning of the widow after the husband's death. So he witnesses the sati also, and he's quite aghast by it. He mentions all the drama.
Does he mention the family, etc., names, etc.?
No,
nothing. He
no.
just
He's an observer only, yeah. So he doesn't.
And which year is his reflections coming from?
This is 14th century. 1334 till about 1340 something, yeah. And he mentions the sati. He's talking about all his interactions with the king and how he treats his people. I've already mentioned that he says that the king's court is never without a person enraged or a person being killed. Yeah? So that continuously happens. And he describes one of his meals with the king. He goes to the Hazar Sutun, the palace of 1,000 pillars, where he has an audience with the king along with a few other people. And he has lunch. The king is eating and he invites everybody else to eat with him, which is a big deal. You don't really get state invitations back then. So he mentions this, and then he says that everybody, after finishing the meal, we all walked out and sat outside the Hazar Sutun. But I could not sit because I had a boil on my bum. So I had great difficulty sitting, and he's quite unhappy about it. And he actually writes that I just couldn't sit and I was very, very uncomfortable. So you see, it's a very, very personal travelogue.
That's what happens if we eat rhino samosa.
He also mentions women of the royal family, in particular the mother of the Sultan. Typically, when you study history, whether it's ancient, medieval, at least, you don't hear of women. Yeah, you don't know many women from these times. In this case, there are no names given, but the mother of the Sultan seems to be a fairly important character. In fact, when the shifting of this capital took place for Muhammad, he shifts the capital from Delhi bag and baggage to Daulatabad. It's said that he also sent, as a sign of confidence in this scheme, he sent off his mother, leading, you could say, almost leading a delegation.
Right.
He also sent off Sufis from here, told them, you go all the way to Deogir, Daulatabad, settle there, and just,
Purify
it's
the
a
place.
PR. It's a PR, policy. So he's making sure that this thing has acceptability among his wider subjects. So as part of his PR, his mother was sent with lots of pomp and show to when the shifting of capital took place. So lots of interesting information about what this guy notes. And Ibn Battuta, much to his discomfort, he was made a Qazi of Delhi. Now this fellow is like, look, I have never been here. I absolutely have no idea about your norms of jurisprudence. Ibn Battuta is a Malik. There are schools of jurisprudence in Islam, what we call mazhab. So mazhab in our common lingo denotes religion, but actually that's not the case. Mazhab are schools of jurisprudence within Islam. And South Asia particularly follows the Hanafi school of thought. Yeah? So now Ibn Battuta has no experience in this, and he's from a Maliki background, and he suddenly made the Qazi of Delhi. And he's really scared that if I do anything wrong, the king might just chop off my head. Yeah, because that's the kind of king he has. One day he's really happy, he's inviting you to have lunch with him.
Bipolar.
The other day, he might not like you and you might be dead. So he's extremely, extremely uncomfortable, and it's with rather great difficulty that he manages to wriggle his way out, and then he finally leaves. He's like, I'm going for good. Please forgive me, and he's off. So it's a very, very interesting account. And
So how long was he here in Delhi?
it was around 1334 till about 41, I think, or 44. If
Did he then go to
7-8 years.
Southeast Asia? He also goes to China, right?
he goes to China as well. Yeah.
From here.
From here. Yeah.
In fact, he is credited with introducing Islam in China.
Oh.
Really?
He is what created with?
Credited with introducing Islam in China.
Oh, really?
Acha, I didn't know
Because
that.
it's that Xinjiang province in the northwest.
No, not that portion. He goes through the sea road, doesn't he?
Okay.
Acha, huh.
He also goes to Lucknow, right?
Lucknow.
Awadh, after the...
He is in the northern belt, yeah. So he's coming in from the Punjab area, like most travelers to India would if you're coming by land. So he describes his, journey from Punjab. Awadh, I'm not sure, does he go that far or not? I'll have to check on that. But it's easy to check. You just Google it and it's online. It's just book.
This is actually